Good evening and welcome. My name is Amy Lizer and I am the Executive Director of the Monroe County Historical Association, and I am delighted that you have joined us for this month's third Thursday lecture series. We're going to get started in just a moment, but I want to let you know that questions can be asked anytime throughout the presentation, but will be answered following the program. We ask that you use the Q&A function that's right down at the bottom of the screen. If you can move your mouse, you'll see a little Q&A. Feel free to go ahead and type any questions or comments you have in there for tonight's speaker. Posting questions in that section helps us keep track of all of them so we can ask them following tonight's program. Now, without any further delay, I am very happy to welcome tonight's guest speaker, Jeff Wright. A little bit about Jeff. Jeffrey Lynn Wright was born in Allentown, Pennsylvania in 1947 to Orville and Louise Kreitzig Wright. He received his Bachelor of Arts degree in history in 1969 from the University of Pittsburgh and his Juris Doctor degree in 1972 from Duquesne University School of Law. Jeffrey attributes his love of history to his parents, and as a child, family vacations included historic destinations around Pennsylvania and the nation. Always a history buff, Jeffrey began researching his family tree and the history of Perry County, Pennsylvania at the very young age of 12. Jeffrey has served a number of terms on the board of directors at the Monroe County Historical Association, including 3 terms as the board president. He was instrumental in writing many legal documents for our organization. Volunteering has always been an important aspect of Jeffrey's life, which is what he's doing tonight, volunteering for us. And he credits his coworkers for instilling in him the importance of giving back to the community. Jeff actually began volunteering with the Historical Association in 1978 when he moved to the area. And he has even been known to dress in costume as Daniel Stroud for special events at the Stroud Mansion. He is not in costume tonight, but we are very, very happy to welcome Jeff, who's going to be speaking this evening on Alexander Mitchell Palmer, Monroe County politician. Welcome, Jeff.
Thank you.
The screen is all yours. Take it away.
Okay. In 1971, when I was a law student in Pittsburgh, I attended a movie entitled Sacco and Vanzetti. At that time, I never imagined that I would be practicing law about a block away from one of the background villains in that movie, let alone giving a talk about him. The Monroe County citizen who reached the highest office in politics was to the Attorney Generalship of the United States. And that was Alexander Mitchell Palmer. He was born in 1872 in Moosehead, outside of Whitehaven, Pennsylvania. The property that he was born on is now private property. The road on the left is Moosehead Road. The road on the right has to do with his name, because that is the railroad bed of the Lehigh Valley Railroad. That is part of the rail to trails, and you can enter the property that way. The Palmer family was involved in a lumber business on this property. By the way, none of the houses or buildings remain. There are some cellar holes, but there are no buildings from that era still there. In the lumber business, they worked towards getting that railroad through there. And also they worked for the railroad in building bridges. The president of the railroad at that time was Alexander Mitchell, and that's the source of our subject's name. A little background on the Palmer family. Obadiah Palmer came to Stroudsburg in the early 1800s and knocked on the door of the Stroud, what's now the Stroud Mansion, to see Daniel Stroud. At that time, he was met at the door by Sarah Van Fleet, who was a maid in that household. However, it's interesting, Sarah's family originally owned the property on which the Stroud Mansion stands. He was applying for a job, and Daniel Stroud at that time was building a mill catty-cornered from the mansion house, and he needed a miller. Obadiah really wasn't much of a miller, but he held himself out to be, and he got the job. I don't think he stuck with it very long because he and his brother opened a butcher business on what is now South 8th Street. It was a slaughterhouse there. It's now the site of ESSA Bank and Trust Company's headquarters. And near that is also in the creek Palmer Island, which has an infamous thing because of a lynching that occurred there. Obadiah and his brother John were members of what is later became known as the Orthodox Quaker meeting in Stroudsburg, which was on Ann Street, or actually on South 8th Street. The building was along South 8th. But in 1827, they broke away from the Orthodox meeting and founded the Hicksite meeting. And that meeting house was on Main Street. And for those who were longtime residents, hard to describe today, but it's where Wyckoff's department store was. Over the years, they moved from that site. However, the cemetery behind Wyckoff's is still there. They moved to 7th and Sarah Street, where the Burr building now stands. A. Mitchell Palmer served on the board of the Hicksite meeting, and he wrote a history of the Quakers in Stroudsburg. Obadiah's, A. Mitchell Palmer's grandfather was Charles Stroud Palmer, and he left the meat butchering business in 1850 and went to Luzerne County, where A. Mitchell was born. A. Mitchell was not a native of Monroe County, although he spent a lot of time here growing up. Charles Stroud Palmer was an active member in the Democratic Party in Stroudsburg. He was a leader in the Stroudsburg Masonic Lodge, and he was a justice of the peace in Stroudsburg. He was also, interestingly, a canal commissioner for the state of Pennsylvania, which is interesting because there's no canal in Monroe County. Mitchell Palmer's father was Samuel Bernard Palmer. And after selling out the lumber business in Luzerne County, he moved the family to Mercer County, Pennsylvania, where he shows up in the 1880 census with his family. Samuel Bernard Palmer was one of those people who had great ideas, but they never came to fruition. I can't even find any real estate that he owned in Monroe County. Of the children of Samuel and his wife, Caroline Albert, by the way, she was from Luzerne County. There's a little town near Moosehead that is known as Albert. The only child that was precocious, particularly, was A. Mitchell. He graduated from Stroudsburg High School in 1886 at the age of 14. You have to, first of all, that building that's pictured there was a fairly new building when he graduated, and the whole concept of high schools was new. So the idea that they would prepare you for college, they weren't that great in doing that altogether because it didn't cover a lot of subjects. So a lot of people who were sending their children on to college sent them to a prep school or an academy. In A. Mitchell Palmer's case, he went to the Moravian Academy in Bethlehem, for 1 year. While he was there, he took an entrance exam for Lehigh University and passed. However, his family, because of his Quaker background, they wanted him to attend a Quaker school, and they decided to send him to Swarthmore College in Swarthmore, Pennsylvania. In order to send him there, the family needed to borrow money from their friends and neighbors. And one of the people they borrowed money from was their family doctor, Dr. Shaw. And Dr. Shaw we will meet up with later. His full name was Dr. Joseph Horace Shaw. He knew from the start what he wanted to be. He wanted to be a lawyer and a statesman. His roommate at Swarthmore was William Cameron Sproul, who would later become governor of Pennsylvania. And he said of Mitchell, Mitchell, you are a worthy gentleman, young, handsome, and well endowed with talent. You orate, you elocute, write for print, sing, and on rare occasions you have been known to study. You love a good time. His classmates realized that Mitchell had a need for power. In 1891, he graduated from Swarthmore College. He was first in his class. He was elected president of the class and a member of Phi Beta Kappa. His prize-winning oration at the graduation sounds something like somebody might even given, or I might have given when I graduated. It goes, the present generation is confronted with an evil which is fast sucking the lifeblood from our nation. The rocks upon which are built all democratic institutions are being assailed, and every year the cloud of distress is growing thicker and lowering its dark shadow about us. Oh, for the days of Washington, Hamilton, and Jefferson, when impurity in elections was unknown. It is possible that the halcyon days of this greatest of republics are come and gone, and like Rome of old, she is to grovel in the dust, dashed down by the corruption of her own sons. One of the things, the family, the families who went to Swarthmore, some of them were from the Philadelphia elite, and at that particular time, there was a movement to reform the government in the city government in Philadelphia, and I suspect that he felt part of that. After graduation, he returned to Stroudsburg in Monroe County. Judge Samuel Smith Dreher, sometimes referred to as the hanging judge, offered him a job as his stenographer. However, there was one problem. Mitchell did not know stenography. So he attended Wood's Business School in Scranton, Pennsylvania for 4 months in the mornings, and in the afternoons he would attend the Lackawanna County Court to see how trials were handled. He came back, he did get the stenographer job with Judge Dreher. He also started to read law with John Brotzman Storm. Storm served in the United States House of Representatives for 4 terms. In 1893, Palmer was admitted to the practice of law in Monroe County and became Storm's law partner. Judge Dreher died in 1893, and Storm was appointed the judge to succeed him until the next election. Storm had a lucrative practice. When Storm left, A. Mitchell inherited that practice. In 1898, he married Roberta Bartlett Dixon, the daughter of Robert Bartlett Dixon, from Easton, Maryland, on the Eastern Shore. He was a wealthy businessman with interests on the Eastern Shore and also in Baltimore. Attending the wedding were 3 congressmen and 1 United States senator. Over time, he bought into the Stroudsburg National Bank and the Times Publishing Company. He would become a director and solicitor of the bank, and he would merge the other Democratic papers in Monroe County into the Times Publishing Company. This was all setting himself up for a political career. Where the money came from, even though law practices are sometimes lucrative, but they're not all that lucrative, I suspect that his father-in-law helped him out. Monroe County politics, you have to go back to really 1860 in the Lincoln election. In that election, Monroe County did not vote for Lincoln, nor did New Jersey next door. However, Stroudsburg and Stroud Township did vote for Lincoln. The majority of the people in Monroe County were less concerned about slavery than they were about immigrants. And that is documented in Leroy Jennings Kohler's The History of Monroe County, Pennsylvania during the Civil War. The immigrant question in Monroe County is in a lot of the biographies of A. Mitchell. Although Monroe County had a small African-American population, it was white of Dutch, English, German, and Scotch-Irish origins. Less than 4% of the population was foreign-born. The political map in Pennsylvania was different than it is today. Today, we think of Philadelphia and Pittsburgh and Center County as Democratic strongholds. But at that time, those Pittsburgh and Philadelphia and Center County were Republican strongholds. As a matter of fact, the cities were run by political bosses, and Center County is where the governors went to retire. The political map, or the Democratic part of Pennsylvania, was located in Pike, Monroe, Carbon, Northampton, Lehigh, and Berks County. The congressional district which Stroudsburg was in consisted of Pike County, Monroe County, Carbon County, and Northampton County. When Mitchell went to get his start in politics, he was blocked by the Democrats in Monroe County. The party at that time was led by Joseph Harshall, who was a doctor and a lawyer, founder of the Security Trust Company. The banks often in Stroudsburg had a political connection. Harvey Huffman, who was a lawyer, relative of the president of our association, and the founder of the Stroudsburg Trust Company. William Bush Eilenberger was a lawyer. Benjamin Franklin Morey was superintendent of schools. And Richard F. Schwartz, he was a farmer. However, he ran the party. He was the chairman. The political battles in Monroe County and in the congressional district were in the Democratic Party, not at the time of the actual elections in November. However, that arguing in the party caused them to lose the election in 1904. An agreement was struck between the different counties that in 1906, Northampton County would get the nomination. In 1908, Monroe would get the nomination. In 1910, Pike, and in 1912, Carbon. In 1906, things went as planned, and Jefferson Davis Broadhead was chosen to be the nominee, and he won. However, in 1908, he was nominated in 1908, and Joseph Horace Shaw was to succeed him. However, Howard Muchler of Northampton County, who was kind of the boss of the Democrats in the congressional district, didn't want Shull to win. And so that gave an opening for Mitchell. He campaigned hard for the election. Shull got so desperate in the primary as to say that he was never repaid for the loan that was made to the family for Mitchell's education. Just sounds like some old Monroe County vinegar to me. But the statement has been made that a district that sends a man to Congress for 1 or even 2 terms just as well have not sent him at all, because he wouldn't develop the contacts, he wouldn't get on the committees that were necessary to do that. This is a portrait of A. Mitchell Palmer, which we have at the Historical Association, which was donated by his daughter, Mary Palmer Lichtenberg. And I'll mention a little bit more about that portrait later. This is a picture of his home on Thomas Street. I would estimate from a couple different sources it was built sometime between 1900 and 1910. In Congress, he opposed tariffs because they raised the price of goods, and he felt supported the corporate trusts. He was unsuccessful in his first term in lowering tariffs. In 1910, he made a speech against President Taft at the time about unkept promises about lowering tariffs. That speech made the national newspapers. He made friends with leaders of the Democratic Party in Congress. In 1910, Palmer organized a meeting with President Taft and the union leaders from Bethlehem Steel to have an investigation performed, which was done, and it did not come in well for Bethlehem Steel. In the 1910 primary, Jefferson Davis Broadhead, by the way, Jefferson Davis Broadhead, number one, the reason he has that name is he was a grandnephew of Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy, and he also studied law with Judge Storm. But anyway, Jefferson Davis Broadhead and Charles Schwab, who was the president of Bethlehem Steel, and Boss Mutchler lined up to settle a strike that was happening at the time and to make it look favorable to Broadhead. However, labor did not, and they supported Palmer, and he was nominated again in 1910. That's a picture from his own newspaper of an advertisement for that campaign. This is a picture of A. Mitchell Palmer's law office on North 7th Street in Stroudsburg. It's behind the Shimsa restaurant. By 1910, the Reform Progressive movement was overturning boss rule in the Democratic Party. The Smith machine in New Jersey was overturned and Woodrow Wilson was elected governor. The Hearst machine in California was overturned. The Joe Bailey rule in Texas was undermined, and Joe Guffey's rule in Pennsylvania was being undermined. 52 of the 64 Pennsylvania delegates to the Democratic National Convention were reform progressives. In 1910, Palmer's name was suggested for governor of Pennsylvania, but he turned it down. In 1910, the Democrats swept the nation. Progressives took control of the state party by 1 vote, and that's an interesting one. The delegate from Pike County, our neighbor, came in late, sat down next to Mitchell, and he asked Mitchell how to vote, and he said, yay. And that was the 1 vote that took over the party. The Democratic Committee elected Palmer to be to the National Committee, but the National Committee would not seat him. It went to old Joe Guffey. In the United States House of Representatives, his respect and power grew. He moved to lower tariffs on steel, which he argued did not protect labor. He passed the House, but not the Senate, where Senator Boaz Penrose from Pennsylvania controlled. In the 1912 election, Palmer supports Thomas Woodrow Wilson for president. Palmer ran the state Democratic convention that pledged its delegates to Wilson. He had trouble holding on to them, but he did. Palmer was chosen to manage the Wilson delegation at the National Convention, and he also delivered the seconding speech for Woodrow Wilson. At that time, he did win his election to the Democratic National Committee. There were 26 rounds of balloting and no nomination, a deadlock. Palmer was offered the presidency as a black horse candidate. He turned it down because of his loyalty to Wilson. Wilson was eventually nominated and won the election. Josephus Daniels, who was a friend of Palmer and the Secretary of the Navy in Wilson's administration, had the following to say. Palmer had an air implying that Wilson owed him a great deal. He rarely mentioned it, but once or twice I heard him say that the nomination was offered and tendered to him, and that if he had listened to it, he might have been president. They say a man gets a presidential bee in his bonnet, never gets it out, and I think it is equally true that a man who in convention thought the nomination was in his grasp is ever afterwards affected by it. Certainly the bee did buzz in Palmer's bonnet. I think it kind of affected how he reacted to different issues over time. Palmer wanted to be Attorney General in Wilson's first administration, but it was not offered to him. He was offered Secretary of Defense, which Palmer could not accept because of his Quaker beliefs. I often feel that was kind of a mean thing for Wilson to have done. During the remainder of his term in the House of Representatives, he pushed for lower tariffs and was successful. He pushed for child labor and was unsuccessful. In 1913, the 17th Amendment to the United States Constitution was approved, which required senators to be elected instead of appointed by the state legislature. And Palmer decides to run for the United States Senate. His opponent was Boaz Penrose, who was an old-time Republican boss from Philadelphia. He had served as an appointed senator from 1897 onward. It was thought that Boaz Penrose might have some problems since he had never run for election, but it seemed he enjoyed the campaigning, and he labeled Palmer as, because of the tariffs, that he was against labor, that laborers would lose their jobs because of his position on the tariffs. And Penrose won. As an aside, Penrose died in 1921. In 1922, Samuel Aikenshall of Stroudsburg, the son of Joseph R. Shaw of Monroe County, ran against George Wharton Pepper of Philadelphia for the Senate. Shaw lost. Shaw would later become the president judge of Monroe County. After losing the senatorial race, Palmer was out of office. He was still active in the Democratic Committee. He supported Vance McCormick of Harrisburg for chairman of the National Democratic Committee. He was successful. And and the presidents usually relied on their House representatives regarding appointments to for postmaster, but Palmer interceded and he was successful in getting Allen H. Barthold appointed as postmaster of Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. The Barthold family has ties to Monroe County. The ribbon mill on South 9th Street, not far from the Mansion House, was owned by Kenneth Barthold, Allen's son. He looked to Wilson to give him a possession. Wilson offered him the judge of the Court of Claims. Palmer turned it down. Palmer supported Wilson in his re-election, which was successful, but Wilson lost Pennsylvania. There is a matter of the MP affair, which involves kind of influence peddling. Palmer actually met with a New York lawyer here in Stroudsburg, to come to Stroudsburg. The lawyer wanted to know Wilson's feeling about trade with Germany. Europe at that time was already in the World War. Palmer met with the lawyer here in Stroudsburg and gave him some information, and that caused a stir. I think there was a congressional investigation of that, although not much ever came of it. During that period, he served on the Monroe County Draft Board. The United States entered the Great War, or what we now know as World War I, in 1917. And Wilson had created the Office of Alien Property Custodian to manage German assets in the United States. Wilson appointed A. Mitchell Palmer as Alien Property Custodian. This was a job he really enjoyed. He had over 38,000 trusts under his control, which at that time was worth $806 million. He had under his control companies that raised sugar, cotton, tobacco, chicory, published newspapers, mined and smelted lead, zinc, copper, silver, and tungsten, manufactured iron and steel products, brewed beer, and produced chocolate, machinery, and munitions. He appointed nationally respected trust companies and trust officers to run these companies. And he also appointed executives of these companies who would later become national business leaders in the United States. He appointed as director of the Bureau of Investigations the former assistant district attorney of New York City, Francis Patrick Garvin. Garvin also was put in charge of the Chemical Foundation, which controlled the German patents in the United States. He also set up an advisory sales committee made up of 4 distinguished bankers and jurists. The secretary, he appointed the director of the office under the Alien Property Administration, his secretary, who was Norman Baldwin Dreher. Dreher was a grandson of Samuel Smith Dreher, who we met earlier. He also appointed as his secretary, his law partner, Allen Richardson Bensinger as his secretary, and Bensinger was the son of Stroudsburg's Presbyterian minister, John Calvin Bensinger, and Allen was also the uncle of the late Alexander Bensinger of Stroudsburg. That's a picture of Wilson and Palmer together. That's a picture of the Alien Property Custodian, Palmer is in the center front of that picture. I wish I knew the names for the other people on that picture, because I think probably Bensinger and Dreher are in that picture. In 1919, Thomas Watt Gregory, who was been the Attorney General, resigned, and Alexander Mitchell Palmer is appointed as his replacement. The job he always wanted, but would lead him to political downfall. After the war, prices rose astronomically, and people looked to the federal government to solve their problems. Republicans wanted price controls, believe it or not, and Democrats wanted free market. Reevaluation of the state, reauthorization of the state price commissions were reinstituted. And one of the things that happened during this period of time was that some of the war powers were still in effect. At least Wilson considered it so, until a treaty was concluded, which did not happen during Wilson's term. And it was a hard time with the price control. There really wasn't much Palmer could do, or anybody could do. Eventually they did come down. That's a cartoon from that era, showing Palmer in it. The biggest problem, or the thing that he concentrated most on, was labor disputes. There were at the time 3,600 strikes in the United States, and Palmer moved cautiously. He usually approached things cautiously. During Woodrow Wilson's illness, a lot of the decisions were made in cabinet meetings. The coal miners strike, and Palmer goes for an injunction, and after that, a long battle involving union leaders, management, and the cabinet. It was viewed by many that he eventually solved or settled the strike. Many considered it a good thing, but the laborers did not. There was also the railroad strike, and that was one of the things that was still under the War's Powers Act. Wilson had refused to give the railroaders an increase in salary. They really deserved it. The labor leaders lost control of their members, and workers and labor leaders were arrested. Palmer calls it a communist revolution. It's the first time that we hear that word come up. Eventually, the strike was settled. The strikes were the main item which Palmer looked after. The Red Scare and the Palmer raids. In 1919, an individual refusing to stand for the national anthem was shot, and the crowd applauded the killer. And this comes from Stanley Coben's book. It says that raised in Monroe County, a hotbed of nativism, he imbibed the local attitudes. Great fear at the time of immigrants from the Southern and Central Europe. Palmer became aware of the large popular hostility towards radicals. His interest, as that happened, his interest in civil liberties abated. There was a planned May Day thing when some 20-some people were to be bombed. Their homes were to be bombed, including Palmer's. Palmer's house in Washington, D.C. was in fact bombed, and that's a picture of it. It looks like it also affected the house next door. At the time of the bombing, Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt lived across the street. And there is the story that's often been printed that Franklin was asked by the newspaper people, did they think that Palmer was upset, and he said, "I think so, because he started to use his Quaker thee and thous." Some people say that story was made up. He appointed Francis Garvin, who he had over in the Alien Property Administration, as the Assistant Attorney General to handle the prosecutions in these cases. And Garvin set up the General Intelligence Division, which later became the Federal Bureau of Investigation. And he appointed as the head of that group J. Edgar Hoover, who was in office for a long time. It turned out that most of the evidence was publications. At the time I was preparing for this talk, I was also reading the second volume of Gotham, and the latter part of that volume deals with a lot of these foreign influences and the Communist Party and different groups. And they had some interrelation with labor as well. Although it has often been said that the communists were too inept to have pulled off any kind of revolution in the United States. But the country was frightened, and there was widespread popular hostility to radicals. As I said, there was public pressure. There was also congressional pressure to crack down on these radicals. There were 10,000 arrests, 350 were detained, and 556 were deported. The punishment was deportation. But deportation did not come under the Department of Justice, it came under the Department of Labor. And the Department of Labor threw out 2,000 of the arrests. His friend, Governor Sproul, backs Palmer in the Crusades. That's from the Morning Call in Allentown at the time. This is from the Philadelphia Inquirer, and there's something to be said about the comment. It's interesting that the comment is made about parlor Bolshevism, and it shows there on the left, 5 more Reds are arrested, 88 may be deported. So you can see the newspapers at the time were reflecting this. In response, because civil liberties were not observed in a lot of these raids, warrants were not obtained, questioning was not had with lawyers present, and because of that, the American Civil Liberties Union came about to defend these people, which has been with us ever since. The Assistant Attorney General for Pennsylvania resigns because he did not feel that people's constitutional rights were being served. As I said, you know, what you hope for does not always get what you want. Palmer, during most of this time, is responding to popularism, I would say, and popularism is a whimsical thing, and whimsies change from time to time. And by the time of the 1920 election, Palmer was in disfavor, although he attempted to run for the presidency. The matters of the laborers with the labor strikes and the settlements and the Red Scare and the handling of that matter. He was dissuaded by the Democratic leadership from running. In that election was nominated James Middleton Cox for president, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt was nominated for vice president. And as we all know, they didn't win either. So there was kind of a timing issue there. I think that, it was time for the Democrats to be out. In 1932, he was asked by Franklin Delano Roosevelt to write the platform for Roosevelt, which he did. He largely wrote that platform. However, Roosevelt did not follow the platform because he thought it was too conservative. His personal life, as I said, he in 1898 married Roberta Bartlett Dixon. They had a daughter who was Mary Dixon Palmer Lichtenberg. And she gave the portrait that I showed earlier to the Historical Association. And at that time, we had a banquet at Mountain Manor, and it was well attended. We were sold out for tickets for it. Dr. Kurt Weimer gave a talk, and there's a pamphlet which the Historical Association has, which Kurt wrote. I believe that Mrs. Lichtenberg was there, but or else one of her children. Roberta Bartlett Dixon Palmer died in 1922. That's a picture of the family. Alexander Mitchell on the left, Roberta on the right, and Mary in the middle. After Roberta's death, this was a thank you that was sent out to well-wishers, or people who gave messages of sympathy. This is in the collection of the Historical Association. In 1923, he married Margaret Ottman Fowler Barber Burrell, a Washington socialite, and that's the announcement of their wedding. That is a picture of Margaret. Margaret, according to Lady Bird Johnson, after Palmer's death, became the lady friend of Samuel Rayburn, the longest sitting Speaker of the United States House of Representatives. She died in 1973 and was buried beside Mitchell in Laurelwood Cemetery. Mitchell died in 1938 and was buried in Laurelwood Cemetery. The cemetery had only been created in 1934. So the LaBar family who conceived the cemetery must have been successful in selling Mitchell a lot. This is a plaque which tells you how to get to the lot. The stones are rather simple. They're flat with the land with brass plaques on top of them. They're not very large. So it's very humble and in consistency with the Quaker background from which he came. I would say that Mitchell Palmer had a great career. Unfortunately, I think the presidential thing, that bee that got in his bonnet started to make him think differently and to react to populism, which kind of cornered him in the end. That's my talk. So I'll wait for Amy for questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Jeff. It was very interesting. We do have some questions. Okay, you ready?
Yes.
Okay. Does Swarthmore College have any portraits or acknowledgement of A. Mitchell Palmer?
I don't know the answer to that. I've been to Swarthmore College, to the Friends Library there, but I've never looked at Palmer stuff. I was looking for my own family stuff.
Right. Okay, next question. What kind of reforms did the progressives support?
Well, child labor was one of them. One of the things was cleaning up a lot of government corruption. was a large part of it. That's why it kind of is called Reform Progressive Movement. One of the things that would come out would be women's suffrage, came out. Very interestingly, all these things, we're talking about 100 years ago when we talk about the Palmer raids, when we talk about women's suffrage, all that. And then the thing we don't talk about much is prohibition, which all came together at the same time. I don't think prohibition was altogether a progressive thing. A lot of the progressives were for booze.
Okay, how about, I was wondering what years he held his law office on 7th Street.
I don't know when he got out of the practice of law. I'm not, that office was succeeded by Charles Raymond Bensinger Sr. in that office location. He died in Washington, D.C. I have a feeling he spent more time down there than in Stroudsburg. If he kept an interest in the office, it was through the Bensingers, I would have thought. What's interesting, the Bensingers are Republicans, where Palmer was Democrat, which has always been a confusing thing for me.
We can use some of the city directories, I'm sure.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess once he moved to Washington, he wouldn't have had that practice anymore.
Well, or else he had it at least, during that period after he was a congressman, because he met with a lawyer from New York in Stroudsburg. Right. So he must have had some kind of a practice, but I'm sure he was tapering off by that time.
Okay.
One of the things that does come up, and a lot of the things I didn't mention, law firms are local councils for corporations. And from time to time in investigations, that would come up, or kind of in political debates, stuff would come up about is representing such and such a corporation, but it was really not the major corporate body that he represented. He just represented them if something happened in Monroe County.
What was the source of Palmer's strong loyalty to Wilson?
Well, I think that's pretty much this progressive reform movement. The progressive reform movement really got its start somewhat in the Republican Party. And during the Wilson period, a lot of those Republicans moved over to the Democratic Party. One of the people who did that and who remained Republican for a long time was Harold LeClaire Ickes, who was the Secretary of Interior in Franklin Delano Roosevelt's administration. And it wasn't until the end of that administration that he became a Democrat. He was one of the most liberal people in Franklin Roosevelt's cabinet, and he was a Republican. It's kind of hard to believe, but that was the case.
Okay, here's a question about the American Civil Liberties Union. Were there any national groups or organizations besides the ACLU that opposed Palmer and his raids?
I'm sure there were, and I think I've read of them, but I can't remember them. That was the main one that I saw.
Right, even on the ACLU website, if you go to their history tab, within the first 3 sentences, they start talking about A. Mitchell Palmer.
Okay.
It's right on there. This question says it's off topic. Did Jacob Stroud live in that big blue house located 2 blocks from Courthouse on the block above Sarah Street? I think they're referring to the Academy House on Thomas.
No, that was built much later.
Yep.
And so, no.
Okay. How was alien property, defined? Was it just German-owned businesses, or were there other nationalities included too? And were the businesses strictly owned by immigrants?
Well, they were owned by Germans. That's who they belonged to, because that was the opposition. Of course, there was other opposition in that war. But the Germans is mainly what they were interested in. It was German companies who were making money in the United States, and they didn't want that money going back to Germany. So that's.
Okay. Well, what was the local reaction to the Palmer raids in Stroudsburg? Was he scorned in town? How did the locals react?
That's interesting. And I one of the things that's interesting, I knew a lot of these people that are involved in this story, or at least if I didn't know them, I knew people who knew them. I worked for Security Bank and Trust Company, which the Shaw family still had an interest in. And my secretary there at one time worked for Joseph Harshall. I never heard, and there was some very Democrat camaraderie there. I never heard anything negative or anything about the raids and Stroudsburg's response. I think they were supportive, if I, would be my thought. Of course, there were Republicans around who may have not been supportive.
Right. Okay. Let's see. We have a question when you mentioned in passing about the hanging. What was
Yes.
the reason for that? Which is
What?
the hanging. You had mentioned the hanging.
Yeah. Well, there was the lynching mob that of a black man who was taken from the jail in Stroudsburg and lynched on Palmer Island. It's been in the papers over and over again. It was a notorious thing and a black mark on Monroe County.
Yeah, we have a lot of information about that in the library at the historical. We have quite a file on that. So Carrie, you can research that for sure. Are there any other questions? I'm just checking my phone. I get some questions through text. Let's see here. Anything in another in Q&A? I'm not seeing too many other questions. Well, here's a chat. Oh, Carrie says, thank you very much for answering her question. Okay, it looks like we don't have any other questions popping up or comments.
Okay.
Another minute. Nope. Looks like we're pretty good. Nothing here. Well, thank you very much, Jeff. We appreciate you volunteering your time yet again for the Historical Association.
You're welcome.
Now you're a whiz at Zoom.
Yeah.
We were hoping by this point that we could be in person, but not yet. That's for sure.
Not yet. Okay.
Yeah. Oh, wait. Is there another question? Oh, we have some more questions. I was just getting ready to end. Okay, what was the Senate's reaction to the Palmer raids?
Well, it depended on which party you were in, I think. There were investigations into the Palmer raids, and A. Mitchell Palmer did testify. In most of that testimony, as I mentioned in my talk, he indicated that most of it was under the control of Francis Garvin. And I think that's true. I think that he was mainly concerned with those labor strikes, and that was his main emphasis. But he certainly was the head of the department at the time and, set the policy. So he was part of that. But he probably did not get involved terribly much in the details of the constitutional violations.
Besides anti-communists, were there any populist progressive crossover?
You get into, and one of the things I was going to say about his speech when he graduated from Swarthmore, I was trying to think of myself, and when I graduated from college, I got to the point of saying I don't like isms, because isms are shorthand and really don't explain what happens. And myself, I'm more pragmatic and think that you have to talk about what do people do and what happens. Communism, as I said, most historians have said the communist threat at that period of time was nil. they were just not capable of pulling off any kind of revolution. What it was a lot of intellectuals, mainly centered in New York City. And as I said, there were crossovers into labor unions. And on the socialist side, I mean, somebody just sent me a quote not long ago about Harry Truman on socialism. A lot of good things in this country would have not happened without socialism. And so that was part of, some of the progressives' things, kind of pulled in some socialist ideas.
Was there any regrets from Palmer to the Sacco and Vanzetti execution?
Well, first of all, that was a criminal trial. It was the state of Massachusetts. It happened during that period, but Palmer really didn't have anything to do with it other than the atmosphere. He was part of the atmosphere at the time. I think the Attorney General in Massachusetts at the time, I think his name was Allen. And I don't know whether he had any regrets either. As I said, Palmer was in the background of the Sacco-Vanzetti thing. He wasn't really part of it.
Okay, the picture, No Gods, No Masters, is about this period. Any comments?
No, I've not seen the movie. Is it a movie?
I guess so.
Yeah, I've not seen it.
Okay. Then was there a House Un-American Activities Committee and hearings or similar committee as in the early 50s? Was Palmer investigated by Congress?
Yes. They investigated the Palmer raids. Yeah.
Did he testify and all of that, or is there
yes,
writings about that, I guess, in DC?
Yeah. One of the books, and I mentioned it, is a book that was printed, I believe, back in the 60s. Unfortunately, it's under my camera. By Stanley Coben. It's called A. Mitchell Palmer, the Politician. It goes into some details on those matters.
I think there's been a lot written about him, and I know there's definitely been some local people writing their thesis on A. Mitchell Palmer.
Oh, really? Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
One of the things is, I mean, Amy, is that you have quite a bit in, you supplied some of those things for my pictures that are part of the Society's collection.
And there's a portrait of A. Mitchell hanging over at the Bar Association, too.
Which we also own, but
yes, it's on loan.
Is on loan, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
That hung, I believe, in First Eastern Bank at the time.
Another comment, socialism is a form of sharing to which a lot of our programs are established upon.
Is that a question or a statement?
I think it's a statement, just a comment.
Okay. Yes,
yeah.
I agree with that.
I agree too. Okay, I'm just going back through to make sure I didn't miss any questions since they started rolling in toward the end. Okay, I think we're good. Well, once again, thank you all for attending. And thank you, Jeff.
Okay, you're welcome.
Thank you. Have a good night, everyone. Take care.
Okay.